Bessie Head's A Question of Power, 1973, is one of the most powerful and challenging novels in African literature. Born in South Africa and exiled to Botswana, Head infuses her work with intensely personal, philosophical, and political concerns. This semi-autobiographical novel delves into the fragile mind of Elizabeth, a mixed-race woman grappling with trauma, exile, and madness in a post-colonial African context. Combining psychological realism with allegorical and mystical elements, A Question of Power explores themes of identity, power, gender, colonialism, and the boundaries between sanity and insanity. Far more than a conventional narrative, the novel is a profound journey into the fragmented consciousness of a woman seeking to assert her identity in a world shaped by power struggles, alienation, and spiritual conflict. Head draws on her own experiences with mental illness and social marginalization, creating a text that is at once deeply personal and universally resonant. Setting: the novel is set in the fictional village of Motabang in Botswana, a peaceful and agrarian community where Elizabeth seeks refuge after being exiled from South Africa. The village serves as a contrast to the psychological and metaphysical chaos unfolding in her mind. The protagonist, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a mixed-race woman born in apartheid South Africa to a white mother and a black father. After suffering alienation and systemic racism, she is exiled to Botswana with her young son. Hoping for a peaceful life, she becomes involved in a local agricultural cooperative. However, her psychological turmoil begins to surface, and she descends into a state of madness marked by hallucinatory encounters with supernatural figures. Descent into madness. Much of the novel takes place inside Elizabeth's mind, as she becomes subject to terrifying hallucinations, primarily involving two male figures, Sello and Dan. These characters function as psychological projections and metaphysical archetypes representing opposing forces of power and oppression. Sello initially appears as a serene monk-like figure but later becomes an instrument of torment, representing a dualistic struggle between spiritual guidance and sadistic control. Dan is an aggressively cruel presence, constantly demeaning Elizabeth, accusing her of evil, and tormenting her with images of degradation, particularly sexual violence and patriarchal domination. These hallucinations plunge Elizabeth into cyclical breakdowns, during which she questions her reality, her worth, and her sanity. Her experiences oscillate between transcendental visions and moments of unbearable psychological pain. Daily life and social integration. While Elizabeth's mind is consumed with torment, she still functions in daily life, particularly through her work at the agricultural cooperative. There, she meets Tom, an American idealist and co-op manager who encourages self-sufficiency, education, and community empowerment. Through her interactions with Tom and others at the co-op, Elizabeth experiences moments of clarity and connection. These contrasting realms, the external world of community and the internal world of spiritual warfare, form the crux of the novel's tension. Gradually, Elizabeth learns to separate her real identity from the hallucinated figures of Sello and Dan, recognizing them as manifestations of external power structures and internalized trauma. Climactic transformation. After years of mental struggle, Elizabeth experiences a slow psychological healing. She begins to dismantle the oppressive forces in her mind by confronting the illusions and deceptions embedded in Sello and Dan. She emerges with a clearer sense of self, spiritual balance, and acceptance of her complex identity. The novel concludes with Elizabeth having achieved a measure of peace, still scarred but more integrated. Her journey is not a traditional redemption arc but a profound meditation on survival, resilience, and the question of power, how it is used, abused, internalized, and transcended. Character analysis. Elizabeth. Elizabeth is one of the most complex protagonists in African literature. A product of racial mixing, political exile, and psychological trauma, She symbolizes the fractured identity of the post-colonial African subject. Her descent into madness reflects both personal history and collective wounds, racism, sexism, and alienation. Yet, she is also a fighter, an intellectual, and a seeker of truth. Her internal battles are metaphors for the spiritual, political, and social struggles of marginalized people everywhere. Cello and Dan. These two hallucinatory figures are not merely products of mental illness, they are allegorical. Cello represents spiritual authority, cultural tradition, and dualism. Initially a comforting presence, he turns into a tormentor, reflecting the dangers of unchecked religious and cultural power. Dan symbolizes patriarchal, imperialist, and sexual violence. His brutal treatment of Elizabeth allegorizes the systemic abuse women suffer under male-dominated structures. Both figures help dramatize the psychological effects of power, especially when internalized by the oppressed. Tom. Tom is a grounding presence and represents rationality, solidarity, and hope. Though not idealized, he offers a model of ethical engagement with Africa. Unlike colonialists or exploiters, he listens, supports, and empowers. His role at the co-op shows the potential for community, cooperation, and healing in contrast to the oppressive forces in Elizabeth's psyche. Major themes. 1. Power and its abuse. The central theme is the question of power, how it operates within individuals, relationships, institutions, and societies. Elizabeth's hallucinations dramatize how oppressive power is internalized and enacted through psychological torment. Both Cello and Dan seek to dominate her, representing religious, sexual, and ideological power. Yet, Elizabeth eventually learns to reject their authority and reclaim her own voice. The novel critiques all forms of power that dehumanize, whether colonial, patriarchal, or spiritual. 2. Madness and sanity. The novel blurs the line between madness and sanity, asking whether mental illness is a reaction to an unjust world. Elizabeth's breakdown is not merely a personal failure but a response to systemic oppression, racial, sexual, and political. In this way, madness becomes a form of protest and a route to deeper understanding. Healing, then, is not about conformity, but about integration, recognition, and transformation. 3. Identity and alienation. As a mixed-race woman exiled from her homeland, Elizabeth's identity is profoundly fragmented. She struggles to find belonging, facing rejection from both black and white communities. Her hallucinations are symbolic of this split identity. The novel emphasizes how colonialism and racism fracture the self and how healing requires reclaiming all aspects of one's identity, even the painful ones. 4. Gender and female experience. Head critiques the gendered nature of power. Elizabeth's torment by Dan is laced with sexual violence, showing how patriarchy degrades and destroys. The novel depicts the unique suffering of women under systems that commodify, control, and devalue them. Yet Elizabeth's survival and resistance also make a question of power a feminist text, emphasizing women's spiritual and intellectual agency. 5. Community and collective healing. Contrasting with Elizabeth's inner chaos is the agricultural co-op in Motabang, a symbol of cooperation, healing, and hope. While not romanticized, the co-op represents the potential for egalitarian, community-based living. It offers a model for reconstructing society outside hierarchical power structures. Narrative style and structure. A question of power eschews traditional linear storytelling. The narrative shifts between realistic depictions of life in Botswana and surreal, nightmarish episodes of hallucination. This fractured structure mirrors Elizabeth's psyche and immerses the reader in her mental landscape. The prose is often dense, abstract, and philosophical, requiring close attention. Head interweaves Jungian, Christian, Buddhist, and African spiritual motifs, creating a richly layered text that defies easy categorization. The use of allegory and internal monologue gives the novel an almost mythic quality. Symbolism. Cello and Dan represent dual faces of power, spiritual and political, seductive and tyrannical. Motabang symbolizes a grounded, practical community, a potential antidote to alienation and fragmentation. Fire, light, and darkness, common motifs reflecting purification, insight, and suffering. Water represents both drowning, overwhelm, and healing, cleansing, tied to Elizabeth's fluctuating mental states. Significance and legacy. A Question of Power is widely regarded as Bessie Head's masterpiece and one of the most important African novels of the 20th century. It broke taboos about mental illness, female sexuality, and racial hybridity, offering a deeply personal yet profoundly political story. The novel is both a feminist and a post-colonial classic. It challenges the reader to rethink sanity, power, and identity not just in Africa but in all contexts where people have been silenced or marginalized. Head's unique narrative voice, wounded, wise, and defiant, continues to resonate with readers seeking stories of survival and spiritual transformation. Conclusion. Bessie Head's A Question of Power is a complex, emotionally charged, and intellectually challenging novel that confronts the darkest corners of the human psyche and the most brutal realities of oppression. Through Elizabeth's harrowing journey, the novel examines how power, religious, political, and sexual, can destroy or liberate. But it is ultimately a story of endurance, resistance, and self-realization. With its fusion of psychological depth, political critique, and spiritual inquiry, A Question of Power stands as a towering achievement in world literature.